Many would say that peace marches can be found decades back in history, some of the most famous examples being those of the Civil Rights era, Gandhi's peaceful protest to free India, and the South African desegregation protests. These are all examples of peaceful protest throughout the globe that can be defined for their major changes, all for the sake of equal rights of a group. A prime example of peaceful protest and marches is the man we know as Gandhi. Gandhi is known as a man of activism and for freeing his home country India of the lingering clutches of Great Britain, which originally colonized India. History.com has described him in their article, Gandhi Leads Civil Disobedience, as the following. Gandhi's real name is Mohandas Gandhi, but he's commonly referred to as Mahatma, meaning great soul. He was born on October 2nd in Porbandar, Gujarat, northwest India in 1869, born into a Hindu mode family. And courteous of his religiously devout mother, his upbringing was infused with Jainist pacifist teachings. As previously told, Great Britain still had its monopoly's clutches in India. Gandhi led a peaceful protest against Britain's monopoly on salt that they placed, prohibiting Indians from collecting or selling salt, which is a main staple of their diet. Gandhi is most famous not only for his protest, but for the use of civil disobedience to bring about change in leading his marches to freedom. A not so well-known peaceful protest was the LA Black Cat protest in 1967. This mostly consisted of homosexual people in LA protesting unnecessary raids the police conducted. These protests came after the police arrested patrons and bartenders alike, unnecessarily beating up bartenders and even owners of the establishments that they searched during this time. All of the searches were committed under the context of searching for those who committed lewd conduct, which included a man kissing another man, in reality for being gay. Those charges, if the accused was found guilty, would then force them to be registered as sex offenders because they kissed someone they loved. So after the cruel police raids occurred, protesters took to the sidewalks, carrying signs and handing out pamphlets telling of the police brutality and treatment of gays. This resulted in hundreds of riot gear wearing police officers. Needless to say, much like today's issues with police officers and the struggle with those from the Civil Rights era, things were pretty tense. As the LA Times puts it, the Black Cat, as it was known then, offered a rare gathering place for Los Angeles gays, but it was no safe haven. Police commonly raided taverns, targeting patrons for their sexual orientation. The police during this time did unnecessary and borderline violent raids throughout LA, trying to break up LGBT meeting sites in the area like the Black Cat Tavern. Given today's current circumstances, though, thankfully they didn't succeed. #love wins. The South African liberation does differ, though, from the first two, in that while it did initially start off as peaceful protesting for the first 5 years or so, they then were persuaded to change their tactics and use violence. In South Africa, there was still segregation during that time, even though the country was technically considered liberated. However, I prefer the term colonized but not totally free. During this time, peaceful marches and protests were led courtesy of the ANC, African National Congress. Their website, anc.org, defined their organization. The ANC, a national liberation movement, was created for the purpose of uniting the African people and spearheading the struggle for fundamental political, social, and economic change. They protested for a decade against racism and oppression, trying to end segregation in South Africa as well as apartheid, a system of segregation that was placed in the government there. And now, on to some famous examples of civil rights peaceful protests that brought major changes to the U.S., aka civil rights marches. The Birmingham Campaign Protest. Oh, if I thought the first Selma March was bad, well, the Birmingham campaign sponsored by the SCLC was just as bad. This was a protest on the streets of Birmingham, AL, in early 1963 that the Southern Christian Leadership Committee led, hoping to desegregate Birmingham. A leader of the SCLC even proposed using children in a nonviolent protest, hoping to curb the tension between them and the police. All of this was done in the support of desegregating public water fountains and lunch lines and giving blacks fair jobs. Protesters were set upon by police officers armed with police dogs that bit and hurt protesters. Firefighters opened fire hydrants and targeted protesters with high-powered hoses to force them off the streets. Children were arrested who took place in the protest while being watched over armed policemen. but thankfully no one was injured enough to have passed away. This protest also caused MLK to be put in jail. However, he did his time and continued to support the civil rights movement. In the end, Project C, as it was called, succeeded, and a committee was formed to monitor the changes of desegregation in Birmingham. Now, moving forward in time to a much friendlier and potentially nicer to hear about march. I may not be a professional podcaster, but it has been kind of fun. Onward to the Washington for Jobs and Freedom March, famously known as the march with the I Have a Dream speech given by MLK. The famous I Had a Dream speech, such a lovely public outcry for equality, as we know, given by MLK on August 27, 1963, at the Washington Monument in D.C. This march went throughout D.C., people holding signs and pickets with messages, some saying things like, I am a man, in protest for wanting fair jobs for blacks throughout the U.S., and specifically the South. The march called upon national attention to the segregation issues that ran rampant in the South due to ingrained white supremacy that still lingered from pre-Civil War. As we all know, this was MLK's most noteworthy speech, causing a spotlight to be put on their efforts in the South, forever giving MLK a place in both Peace March history and global history. Bloody Sunday is seen as one of the ugliest, most horrifying in terms of violence peace marches that's taken place in history. Initially, even before Bloody Sunday occurred, a group came together to make a piece of history. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led a small voting campaign in the small town of Selma, Alabama, that was known for consistent resistance of black voting. After the SNCC's efforts failed, given local law enforcement's strict resistance, MLK and others joined the fight after being persuaded by local activists, trying to make this a national concern. After leading a few demonstrations to local courthouses, finally the first shot that started it all was fired. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a protester, was fatally shot by a state trooper during one of these demonstrations. This caused a protest march from Selma to Montgomery to be formed, famously known as Bloody Sunday. Protesters of the march crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965, over the Mississippi River, but almost immediately thereafter they were blocked by Alabama state troopers armed with clubs and tear gas. After refusing to turn around, the protesters were set upon by the local police and state troopers. They had tear gas sprayed on them, were trampled, some whipped and beat with clubs. MLK called for civil rights and urged the government to give a second protest federal protection, which was granted, after which the second march continued onward, protected by the feds. However, there were local law officers and white supremacist people and families who stood on the sidelines with menacing glares. Now on to our next topic. A heroic man, a man of good stature, upstanding morals, and the guts to speak for what's right. You're thinking MLK, right? Well, yes, Bloody Sunday is seen as one of the ugliest, most horrifying in terms of violence peace marches that's taken place in history. Initially, even before Bloody Sunday occurred, a group came together to make a piece of history. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led a small voting campaign in the small town of Selma, Alabama, that was known for consistent resistance of black voting. After the SNCC's efforts failed, given local law enforcement's strict resistance, MLK and others joined the fight after being persuaded by local activists, trying to make this a national concern. After leading a few demonstrations to local courthouses, finally the first shot that started it all was fired. Jimmy Lee Jackson, a protester, was fatally shot by a state trooper during one of these demonstrations. This caused a protest march from Selma to Montgomery to be formed, famously known as Bloody Sunday. Protesters of the march crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965, over the Mississippi River, but almost immediately thereafter they were blocked by Alabama state troopers armed with clubs and tear gas. After refusing to turn around, the protesters were set upon by the local police and state troopers. They had tear gas sprayed on them, were trampled, some whipped and beat with clubs. MLK called for civil rights and urged the government to give a second protest federal protection, which was granted, after which the second march continued onward, protected by the feds. However, there were local officers and white supremacist people and families who stood on the sidelines with menacing glares. Now on to our next topic. A heroic man, a man of good stature, upstanding morals, and the guts to speak for what's right. You're thinking I'm okay, right? Well, guess again. It's Philip Randolph, in case you're wondering. A. Philip Randolph is a man who is both important in terms of black rights and a man who isn't given enough credit for the change he took a major part in creating. Randolph is known for being one of the most, if not most, important leaders for black rights in what's known as the labor movement. To be brief, the labor movement's goal was to make better wages, hours, and safer work conditions for the industrial sector. This included black rights and desegregation of the military, which Randolph led the fight for. Desegregation of the military was sorely needed during this time, especially given what we've seen through history how the segregated blacks of the military were treated in the Civil War, being given literally the worst paying jobs and worst conditioned jobs that no one wanted. Given that the troops of Randolph's day were still being segregated against and treated unfairly in the military, it's no surprise A. Philip Randolph wanted to desegregate it, especially given the treatment of black soldiers in the Civil War. These are the reasons why Randolph wanted to desegregate the military, and wrote the government and President Truman, asking for desegregation, and while he made his position known, he still wasn't being heard. According to WHHA, as Randolph was called before the Senate Armed Services Committee, he gave the following testimony. This time, Negroes will not take the Jim Crow laws lying down. The conscience of the world will be shaken as by nothing else when thousands and thousands of us second-class Americans choose imprisonment in preference to permanent military slavery. After this statement, he called for total desegregation in armed forces. After his testimony, it was implied that those who would follow his advice would basically be charged with treason, but he fired back, saying, we would be willing to absorb the violence, absorb the terrorism, to face the music, and to take whatever comes, and we, as a matter of fact, just consider that we are more loyal to our country than the people who perpetrate segregation and discrimination upon Negroes because of color or race. In light of this, A. Philip Randolph was an activist of desegregation, of black rights in the armed forces, and of equality, all while simply taking a stand by marching, writing letters and telegrams, and taking a strong stand while giving testimony and laying out his terms for desegregation. Well, given the varying global and local examples of peace marches and their effects, there can be little doubt that they get the job done, regardless of how long it may take. For South Africa, it was about a decade. For LA, while gays were accepted, they weren't given rights until last June, a total of almost 50 years to get gay marriage nationally accepted and legalized. And let's not forget, there's still controversy in various states, the South. Activists for the Civil Rights era and around the globe knew that even though they had a choice of using violence, that all it would do was upset people instead of causing change. They knew, people like MLK and Gandhi knew, that the right path to take was peace. Using peace marches and speeches, and calling for peaceful civil protests throughout the decades. Overall, while peace marches take time, determination, a strong spirit, and endurance, it's more than worth the long wait for their causes to be justified.